The bridge at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. The waterlogged satchel charge felt heavier than it should have as Jake McNiece pressed himself against the stone wall, listening to the MG42's distinctive chatter echo across the Norman countryside. 3 hours past dawn, and the mission had already gone sideways in ways that would never make it into the after-action reports. The bridge at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont still stood intact. German armor was rumbling somewhere beyond the hedgerows, and half his filthy 13 were scattered across drop zones that existed only on some staff officer's optimistic map. The leather satchel told its own story of the botched night drop, soaked during the canal crossing, its fuses compromised by brackish water, the TNT blocks inside representing the thin margin between success and catastrophe. McNiece had rigged it twice already, each time finding new problems with the detonation cord that seemed determined to fray at the worst possible moment. The single length of primer cord remaining was barely long enough to reach the bridge's central support beam, assuming he could get close enough without the German machine gunners turning him into another casualty statistic. Sergeant Murphy crawled up beside him, his jump jacket torn from a landing that had deposited him in a thorn hedge 2 miles from the designated zone. The younger man's eyes held that particular mixture of exhaustion and nervous energy that came from too many hours under fire with too little ammunition. "Jake, we got word from Lieutenant Morrison. Krautarmer's moving up the coastal road, maybe 20 minutes out. Orders are to blow the bridge now, with or without proper placement." McNiece studied the stone and steel structure spanning the narrow canal. The bridge had been built to last, its medieval stonework reinforced with modern steel girders that hummed faintly under the vibration of distant tank engines. According to the manual, he needed at least 3 properly placed charges to bring down a span this size. What he had was 1 waterlogged satchel, compromised fuses, and a prayer that his improvised timer would give him enough seconds to clear the blast radius. "Manual says we need more explosives than we got," McNiece muttered, fingering the frayed detonation cord. But the manual never dropped into a flooded field at dark 30 with half the gear scattered to hell and gone. Through the morning mist, he could see movement in the farmhouse windows across the canal. Civilians who'd been caught between American paratroopers and German defenders, their faces pale against the dirty glass. An elderly farmer clutched his granddaughter, while 2 boys pressed close to their grandmother's skirts. They'd been trapped there since the first exchange of fire, too terrified to move, while bullets shattered their windows and mortar rounds cratered their yard. The sight of those frightened faces changed something fundamental in McNiece's calculations. The bridge was a tactical objective, marked on maps and measured in strategic importance. But those people in the farmhouse basement were real, immediate, and depending on decisions he made in the next few minutes. Standard demolition procedure would bring down the span efficiently, but the debris field might crush the building where the family huddled. Murphy followed his gaze toward the farmhouse, understanding passing between them without words. "They're using them as shields, Jake. Krauts know we won't blow the bridge with civilians that close." McNiece hefted the satchel charge, feeling the weight of wet TNT and uncertain fuses. His fingers found the improvised timer he'd cobbled together from salvaged parts, a mechanism that might give him 90 seconds or might detonate immediately, depending on how much damage the canal water had done to its delicate components. "Maybe we don't blow it the way they expect," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had kept his men alive through 2 years of impossible missions. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German machine gun position dominated the eastern approach to the bridge, its barrel traversing in lazy arcs that covered every possible angle of attack. McNiece counted muzzle flashes. At least 2 MG42s, possibly a third, positioned in the church tower beyond the canal. The morning fog was lifting, revealing details that made his stomach tighten with familiar pre-combat dread. Lieutenant Morrison's breathing down our necks about that armor column. Murphy whispered, checking his rifle for the third time in 5 minutes. "Says we got maybe 15 minutes before those panzers reach the crossroads." McNiece ignored the time pressure, his attention focused on the bridge's construction. The medieval stonework formed the foundation, but steel girders carried the actual load, modern engineering grafted onto ancient craftsmanship. If he could place the charge correctly, physics would do most of the work. The problem was getting close enough to the critical stress point without becoming target practice for the German gunners. The waterlogged satchel felt unstable in his hands, its contents shifted by the rough landing and canal crossing. He'd rewired the fuses twice, but salt water had corroded connections that should have been reliable. The detonation cord was another variable, frayed near the blasting cap, its protective sheath compromised. In training, they'd been taught to abort missions with this much equipment damage, but training had never included civilian faces pressed against farmhouse windows. Through his field glasses, McNiece studied the German positions. The main machine gun nest was sandbagged into the stone parapet, its crew rotating between the weapon and observation duties. They were professionals, he realized, not the green conscripts or aging reservists that sometimes held secondary positions. These men knew their business, and they'd sighted their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the bridge approach into a killing ground. "What you thinking, Jake?" Murphy's voice carried undertones of worry that had nothing to do with German machine guns. McNiece's reputation for improvisation was well earned, but it came with a cost that weighed on every man who followed him into situations that existed somewhere between tactical innovation and outright insubordination. The Filthy 13 had earned their nickname through actions that made commanding officers nervous and enemy forces unpredictable. But this morning felt different, heavier with consequences that would ripple beyond military efficiency reports. "I'm thinking we got two problems, not one," McNiece said quietly. "Those machine gunners expect us to come straight at the bridge, and that farmhouse full of civilians makes this personal for them. They figure we won't risk killing French kids for a tactical objective." He was already moving as he spoke, belly crawling through the hedgerow that bordered the canal. The wet earth soaked through his already sodden uniform, adding pounds of mud to gear that felt too heavy and too light simultaneously. Too heavy to move quietly, too light to stop the bullets that would come if his timing went wrong. The sound of tank engines grew louder, diesel rumbles that carried clearly across the Norman countryside. Somewhere beyond the morning mist, German armor was grinding toward the crossroads that made this particular bridge worth dying for. McNiece checked his improvised timer one more time, its mechanism jury-rigged from parachute components and salvaged electronics. 90 seconds, assuming everything worked perfectly, assuming his modifications held under the stress of detonation, assuming the blast would drop the span cleanly instead of scattering debris across the farmhouse where frightened children waited for adults to decide their fate. Murphy followed at a careful distance, his breathing audible in the sudden quiet between machine gun bursts. The German gunners were conserving ammunition now, firing only when movement caught their attention. That discipline suggested they expected reinforcement soon, possibly from the same armor column that Lieutenant Morrison was tracking on his situation map. The farmhouse basement held 6 people: the elderly farmer who owned the property, his daughter-in-law, and 4 grandchildren ranging from 6 to 14 years old. McNiece could see them clearly now through a gap in the stone foundation, their faces pale in the dim light filtering through shattered windows. The oldest boy clutched a wooden toy soldier, its paint chipped from countless battles fought in safer times. Radio chatter crackled from Murphy's pack, fragments of reports from other units scattered across the Normandy drop zones. The night's operations had been a mixed success, with some bridges blown on schedule, while others remained in German hands. But the armor column approaching Sainte-Marie-du-Mont represented something larger than tactical objectives. If those panzers reached the beachhead, they could roll up American positions that were still consolidating after the dawn landings. "Morrison's getting pressure from battalion," Murphy reported quietly. They want this bridge down regardless of collateral complications. Collateral complications. Military language had a way of reducing human faces to statistical abstractions. But McNiece couldn't unsee the frightened children or forget the way the grandmother had pulled them close when the first mortar rounds impacted near the farmhouse. His hands worked automatically, checking the satchel charge's modified timer while his mind wrestled with calculations that had nothing to do with explosive yields or structural engineering. The detonation cord remained his biggest concern. Its frayed sheath exposed copper wire that might short-circuit under moisture, turning a precisely timed demolition into random catastrophe. He'd spliced it twice already, using techniques learned from a combat engineer who died at Anzio, his knowledge surviving in the hands of men who'd watched him work. "You know what they'll put in the report," Murphy said suddenly, his voice barely audible above distant artillery. "Bridge destroyed as ordered, mission successful. Won't mention them folks in the basement or the way you rigged that charge to blow clean instead of spraying shrapnel across their roof." McNiece understood the weight behind those words. Military citations had a way of compressing complex human moments into clean narrative lines. Heroic action, tactical success, enemy position neutralized. The after-action reports would note tonnage of explosives expended, bridges destroyed, enemy movement delayed. They wouldn't capture the 90 seconds when everything balanced on improvised fuses and one man's refusal to sacrifice civilians for operational efficiency. The machine gun opened fire again, its burst stitching across the canal bank where Murphy had shown momentary movement. Concrete chips flew from the farmhouse wall, and McNiece heard children crying in the basement. Thin voices that carried clearly in the morning air. The German gunners were either excellent marksmen or deliberately targeting close to the building, using fear as a weapon more precise than high explosives. Through his field glasses, McNiece watched the enemy positions with professional interest. The main machine gun crew was rotating duties, keeping fresh eyes on the approaches while maintaining sustained fire capability. They'd been briefed on American airborne tactics, he realized. They knew paratroopers would try to take the bridge from multiple angles, using speed and surprise to overcome defensive advantages. What they didn't expect was a demolition NCO who'd spent 2 years learning that survival often meant changing the rules in the middle of the game. McNiece's modifications to the satchel charge reflected hard-earned experience with improvised explosives and structural weak points. If placed correctly, the blast would drop the bridge's center span cleanly into the canal, creating an obstacle that tanks couldn't cross without engineering support. But correctly meant getting within 20 yards of German machine guns that commanded perfect fields of fire across open ground. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. McNiece moved through the hedgerow with patient deliberation, each yard gained through careful observation of German firing patterns. The machine gunners were good, but they were human. Their attention wavered slightly during crew rotations, creating brief windows when movement might go unnoticed. He counted seconds between bursts, memorizing the rhythm of suppressive fire that kept his squad pinned behind inadequate cover. The satchel charge felt heavier with each yard gained toward the bridge. Its improvised timer mechanism clicked softly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet. 90 seconds from activation to detonation, assuming his modifications worked as intended. 90 seconds to reach the optimal placement point, arm the charge, and clear enough distance to survive the blast that would drop several tons of stone and steel into the canal below. Murphy provided covering fire from the tree line, his rifle cracking at careful intervals to keep the German gunners distracted. But McNiece knew that sustained suppression was impossible with their limited ammunition. The mission had to succeed on the first attempt. There would be no second chances if the charge failed to detonate or if German reinforcements arrived while he was exposed on the bridge approach. 20 yards from the target, McNiece could hear individual voices from the machine gun position. German commands, clipped and professional, mixed with the mechanical sounds of weapon maintenance and ammunition handling. These weren't desperate men fighting a losing battle. They were confident soldiers executing a defensive plan that had worked against previous American attacks. The bridge's steel girders hummed with vibrations from the approaching tank column. Through the morning mist, McNiece could see movement on the eastern bank, tracked vehicles grinding toward the canal crossing that represented their fastest route to the American beachhead. Lieutenant Morrison's time estimates had been optimistic. The Panzers were closer than expected, their arrival measured in minutes rather than hours. McNiece activated the timer with steady hands that betrayed none of the fear coursing through his nervous system. 90 seconds started counting down with mechanical precision, each second bringing him closer to a moment when physics and explosive chemistry would determine whether his calculations were correct. The modified fuses felt fragile under his fingers, improvised connections that might hold or might fail, depending on factors beyond his control. The final approach required crossing 15 yards of open ground under direct observation from German positions. McNiece waited for the machine gun crew's next rotation, then sprinted across the gap with the desperate speed of a man carrying live explosives toward enemy weapons. Bullets cracked past his head, close enough to feel the pressure waves, far enough away to let him reach the bridge's stone foundation. The placement point was exactly where his structural analysis had indicated, a junction where medieval stonework met modern steel reinforcement. McNiece wedged the satchel charge against the girder with practiced efficiency, his hands working automatically while his mind tracked the remaining time on his improvised timer. 60 seconds to clear the blast radius. 60 seconds to reach minimum safe distance, while German machine gunners adjusted their fire to target his withdrawal route. The charge armed with a soft click that seemed to echo across the entire battlefield. McNiece turned toward his own lines, calculating angles and distances with the desperate precision of a man racing against explosive physics. The German gunners had found his range now. Bullets sparked off stone and steel around him as he bounded through cover that seemed inadequate for protecting anything larger than field mice. 40 seconds remaining. The timer mechanism counted down with inexorable precision, its modified components functioning exactly as McNiece had intended when he'd rewired the system during the pre-dawn darkness. But 40 seconds felt simultaneously endless and impossibly brief. Time enough for doubt to creep in, not enough for second-guessing decisions that were already committed to explosive chemistry. The farmhouse windows showed movement, civilian faces tracking his retreat with expressions that mixed hope and terror. Those children would remember this morning for the rest of their lives, McNiece realized. They would carry memories of American paratroopers and German machine guns, of explosions that shook their home's foundation and changed the geography of their small world forever. 20 seconds before detonation, McNiece realized his calculations were wrong. The blast radius he'd computed in his head, crouched behind the stone wall, with German bullets whining overhead, had been based on standard TNT charges and normal fusing mechanisms. But the satchel in his hands contained waterlogged explosives and improvised detonators, variables that could multiply the explosive force unpredictably. What he'd intended as a surgical demolition might become a catastrophic detonation that would shower debris across the farmhouse basement where 6 civilians waited for the shooting to stop. The secret that would never appear in any after-action report was simple. Jake McNiece ran back toward the bridge. Murphy's shout echoed across the canal, a wordless cry of disbelief as his squad leader sprinted directly into the machine gun field of fire. The German gunners reacted with professional efficiency, their weapon traversing to track the running figure who'd suddenly reversed course for reasons they couldn't comprehend. Bullets sparked off cobblestones and ricocheted from steel girders as McNiece covered ground with the desperate speed of a man racing against his own explosives. 15 seconds on the timer. The satchel charge sat exactly where he'd placed it, armed and counting down with mechanical precision. McNiece's hands shook as he attempted to relocate the device, not to disarm it, but to shift its position against the girder's base, where the blast would be contained by the bridge's own structure. The margin for error was measured in inches and seconds, physics calculations performed under conditions that would have made his demolitions instructors weep. 10 seconds. The German machine gunner had found his range, bullets chipping stone, within arm's reach of the hunched figure, wrestling with explosives that refused to cooperate. The satchel's leather had swollen from water damage, wedging it tighter against the girder than McNiece had intended. He pulled with desperate strength, feeling stitches tear and contents shift as the charge finally came free. 7 seconds. McNiece repositioned the satchel against the girder's foundation, where several tons of stone would help direct the blast downward instead of outward. It was still going to be close, too close for comfort, too close for regulation safety margins. But the children in the farmhouse basement might survive what was coming, and sometimes that was the best outcome available in a war that specialized in impossible choices. 5 seconds. McNiece turned and ran, his legs pumping with the kind of speed that comes from pure terror mixed with stubborn determination. The German gunners were tracking him now, their fire disciplined and accurate. Stone fragments peppered his back as bullets found their range, but the bridge's own structure provided intermittent cover as he bounded toward his own lines. 3 seconds. He could see Murphy's face clearly now, eyes wide, with the particular expression men wore when watching friends attempt things that violated basic survival instincts. The rest of the squad had taken cover behind whatever protection they could find, understanding that the next few moments would either vindicate McNiece's reputation for impossible solutions or add his name to the casualty lists that were already too long. 2 seconds. McNiece dove behind the stone wall where this mission had started, pressing his face into mud that smelled of cordite and fear. His hands covered his head in a gesture that was part training and part instinct, preparing for an explosion that might level the landscape or might fizzle into anticlimactic failure, depending on how much damage the canal water had done to his improvised fuses. 1 second. In the farmhouse basement, the elderly farmer pulled his grandchildren close, whispering reassurances in French that he didn't entirely believe himself. The youngest girl clutched her wooden doll with the kind of grip that leaves fingernail marks in soft pine. Above them, German soldiers adjusted their weapons for targets they couldn't quite track through the morning mist. 0. The explosion came exactly on schedule. Not the catastrophic blast McNiece had feared, but a sharp crack that sent the bridge's center span dropping cleanly into the canal below. Stone and steel collapsed with thunderous precision, creating a gap that no tank could cross without engineering support that would take hours to organize. The farmhouse windows rattled in their frames, but the building held, its occupants shaken but unharmed. The after-action report filed 3 days later was a masterpiece of military understatement. Bridge at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont destroyed as ordered. Enemy advance delayed. No friendly casualties. Mission successful. 27 words that compressed a morning of impossible choices into clean administrative language, suitable for filing in folders that would gather dust in archives that few people would ever visit. Lieutenant Morrison never asked McNiece about the details, the sprint back toward his own explosives, the split-second repositioning under direct fire, the calculations that balanced demolition efficiency against civilian lives. Some questions were better left unasked in an army that valued results over methodology, especially when the results spoke for themselves. The German tank column had been forced to detour 15 miles through countryside that other American units had already prepared for defensive action. Murphy understood what had really happened, but he never discussed it directly. Instead, He took to checking McNiece's equipment with extra care before missions, ensuring that fuses were properly waterproofed and detonation cord inspected for damage. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the morning, when improvisation and conscience had converged in ways that training manuals never anticipated. The French family from the farmhouse appeared at the temporary command post 2 days after the bridge demolition. The elderly farmer carried a small wooden cross carved from timber that had been part of the original medieval structure, a piece of the bridge that had survived both the German occupation and American liberation. He pressed it into McNiece's hands with words that needed no translation, gratitude expressed in the universal language of tears and trembling fingers. McNiece kept the cross in his breast pocket through the remainder of the Normandy campaign, a tangible reminder of the morning when military objectives had intersected with human faces. He never spoke about it publicly, never mentioned the carved wood in letters home or conversations with replacement soldiers who joined the unit as casualties mounted. Some memories were too complex for easy storytelling, too layered with moral ambiguity for the kind of heroic narratives that war correspondents preferred. Years later, sitting in an Oklahoma diner with coffee that had grown cold while he stared out the window, McNiece would hear the rumble of freight trains crossing the steel bridge that carried the Santa Fe line over the Canadian River. The sound brought him back to Sainte-Marie-du-Mont with startling clarity, not the explosion itself, but the moments beforehand when time had compressed into split-second decisions that carried lifelong weight. The wooden cross sat in a cigar box on his dresser, alongside other tokens from the European campaign, a dented compass that had guided him through Dutch hedgerows, a torn section of parachute silk that had caught on Norman church steeples, a faded photograph of men who'd shared rations and foxholes, and the peculiar intimacy of facing death together. But the cross was different, heavier with memory than its physical weight suggested. Murphy visited occasionally, their conversations touching on shared experiences with the careful indirection of men who understood that some stories were too important for casual retelling. They discussed weather, work, family news, surface topics that danced around deeper currents of memory and guilt and pride that mixed together in proportions that changed with each passing year. The legend of the Filthy 13 grew in peacetime, their exploits burnished by distance and selective memory into narratives suitable for magazine articles and television documentaries. McNiece's bridge demolitions were mentioned frequently, his reputation for improvisation and insubordination transformed into colorful anecdotes about American resourcefulness under fire. But the reporters never asked about the weight that settled in a man's chest when he remembered faces pressed against farmhouse windows, or the way his hands still trembled sometimes when thunder rolled across Oklahoma's wide sky. The real story remained locked in a cigar box, on a dresser in a frame house where an aging paratrooper kept tokens from a time when split-second decisions had determined who lived and who died, who remembered and who forgot, who carried the weight forward and who set it down. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.